the highest achievement so far was that we just we still perceive ourselves through the lens of sexuality, and what we managed to do is just we managed to make this structure, pansexualistic structure, like less hierarchical and a little bit diffused, but in general, through this contemporary discourse of genders, for example, instead of sex. But still, it is pansexualistic. It remains pansexualistic, just changed a bit, but still pansexualistic. And so this preservation of sexuality as a basis point of reference of our self-determination, it like compels us to keep at the basis of our self-comprehension the hierarchical perspective, because sexuality originally retains this hierarchical structure. So no matter how we will try to diffuse it, to make it more diffuse, to make it less hierarchical, if it's sexuality, it's originally hierarchical. There's nothing you can do with it. And it was revealed long time ago by feminist discourse that sexuality is phallocentric. It's that is to say, it is constructed around the subjective experience of penis. It's male experience, of course. And it was criticized, the traditional sexuality was criticized for this. And among many others, Iris Young recognized that, let's see, active sexuality is the erected penis. So we recognize this, and what our next step, what we want to do, is we want to change the sexuality, and we consider that it shouldn't be seen in this way. So kind of invent other types of sexuality, but somehow we are not daring to face that we already understand, because paradoxically we still keep the hope that construction formed around the center as a phallocentric structure. We think that it can be radically modified, so modified to that extent that it will be deprived of its essence. So we recognize this phallocentrism as its essence, but we somehow think that we can change the whole thing and the very basis of it. And it's difficult to explain why the conception of sexuality is so dear to us, why we want to change it in such a way. Why is this is something we still want to keep as the basis of our self-determination, just make it less hierarchical, so to say. And because sexuality is, first of all, the penis, the phallus, all other, so the problems with traditional sexuality, understood in traditional initial way, that was because this is the center, something that defines sexuality from the beginning of this concept of conceptualization of human beings through sexuality. First, it was defined as something phallocentric, and this means that all other elements of human reality were seen through this perspective, through the prism of sexuality. And because the center of this sexuality was a penis, it's phallocentric, all other kinds of human reality were seen as emanation, so to say, as different emanation of the phallus. And everything, this is because everything placed within this perspective, even if it's placed there in order kind of to negate or to be opposed to this center, it still just reaffirms its centrality. And we'll talk about this a bit more. For example, woman, if placed within the scope of pansexualistic discourse, is seen as someone who has no penis. This is how she is defined within the pansexualistic, basic pansexualistic view. Vagina is defined as absence of penis, and something is used to satisfy it. We also, and because sexuality is phallocentric, the intercourse is considered heterosexual, of course. Intercourse is considered to be a true ontological act, the main act of reproduction, of something that is crucial for human being, the center of human existence. And And there is, of course, only one act of intercourse. It's heterosexual, because homosexual intercourse is a construction that reflects this basic. It's just deviated form, because there is no other way to interpret homosexual intercourse as not a deviated kind of heterosexual. This because initial sexual act is heterosexual. We'll discuss it a bit more as well. So within the pansexualistic perspective, all types of attachment, all types of human proximity, everything is defined as transformed desire for sexual intercourse. For example, pregnancy is defined as something secondary, as something what happens after the intercourse, and breastfeeding, maternal care is interpreted, for example, by Freud as transformed or repressed sexuality, and child is interpreted as perverted childhood, as child is a bearer of perverted, deviated sexuality. So among all the necessary elements of the reproductive complex, everything we need to survive, there was everything we do, basically. Among all of those elements of life-sustaining processes, it was just chosen one, heterosexual sexual act, which is centered around phallus, and everything else was explained around it. And this spreading away from the phallus we call sexuality. This is what is at the basis of the concept of sexuality. And all the other elements of human life-sustaining processes, like vagina, children, lactation, care, maternal care, were defined, if they're placed within the sphere of sexuality, of concept of sexuality, they are conceptualized as secondary in regard to phallus, as something derived from this basic act, from this basic reality. And as long as we persist within this perspective of pansexualism, there is no other way. There is no way out of this. Even if we rename penis as phallus and claim that penis and phallus are something different, like Lacan did, or claim that it's simply the symbolic order, this is how language functions, what kind of not a material reality, but it is still, it's, you can't get away from this. It's still organized around it. And this line of thought and the very necessity of such justification that phallus is not penis, it only reaffirms the basic centrality of the penis. And one of the, there is another quote. Yeah. So Monique Wittig was certainly right to claim that man and woman are only categories founded upon heterosexuality. And she claims that woman has meaning only in heterosexual system of thought. So what she criticizes is the very concept of woman, because she recognizes that heterosexual perspective is hierarchical, and this perspective perceives man as a center and constitute woman into something other, different. So according to Monique Wittig, our mind is heterosexual, and this means that the man is in the center and woman is defined as something other in comparison to man. And she even goes to equate women to slaves. She claims that men are not different, whites are not different, nor are the masters, not the blacks, as well as the slaves are. And she asked, can we redeem slave? Can we redeem nigger, negress? How is woman different? We'll continue to write white, master, man. So she's against the concept of woman, and she equates for her it's something like a slave. So what Wittig suggests is to renounce the woman and the man for the reason that those are basic concepts of heterosexual normativity. And she explained if we continue to speak of ourselves as and perceive ourselves as woman or as woman or man, this is the instrument that will allow heterosexuality to persist, this heterosexual normativity. And the task she formulates is to overthrow the entire discourse of heterosexuality and the language that attributes one of the two sexes as essential and something that defines what human are, and renouncing of what she wants is to renounce a concept of woman, the same as we did with the concept of slave, and is for her it's necessary strategy for the transformation of the very way we perceive ourselves. And in this way, she claims that the new order of materiality will be established, and this is impossible if for her this is impossible to establish a new order of materiality if we'll not transform the concept, because if we'll use the concept of a woman, we call some people woman, some people man, and this will preserve this hierarchical normativity of heterosexuality. And so she claimed that this woman and man as concept has to disappear. And what Monique Wittig suggests is that we have to, the concept we have to use is a concept of lesbianism. And she explains that lesbians are not women. For her, they're not women. And but my claim is here that this replacement that Wittig offers, it doesn't basically solve the problem it was intended to solve. It will not help if we replace the concept of woman with the concept of lesbians, because we will still remain within the sphere of sexuality. We'll still define ourselves within the sphere of sexuality. For Wittig, the problem was heterosexuality, and this is what she was fighting with. But it's sexuality in general that we have to fight with, not just heterosexuality, but because the very concept of sexuality presupposes this texture delineation on two sexes, because sexual beings are sexed beings, and this is because the very word sexual, it just means pertaining to the fact of being male or female. This is what sex means, what the concept of sexuality, what it implies. There are sexes, female and male, and it derived from Latin sexualis, means relating to sex, and sex derived from word seco, that is means division on half, that is divide or cut. So we can only talk about same sex or opposite sex. It just presupposes, the very concept of sexuality presupposes this division. And the roots of the word sexuality implies this difference as crucial, as basic in comprehension of humans. And since sexuality is based on this initial differentiation of sexes, understood as two opposites, and there cannot be other true type of sexuality except for heterosexuality. So all the sexuality is heterosexuality, no matter how we try to switch this perspective while remaining within this perspective. It's kind of impossible. So it is not the heterosexual mind probably that has to be undermined, but the pansexualistic perspective in general. And the concept of lesbianism that Monique Wittig suggests is constructed within the sphere of sexuality. It disturbs it, of course, but it doesn't undermine it. It preserves the initial male-centrated structure. And Wittig is opposed to heterosexuality, but she still maintains sexuality. And female homosexuality is, as I said, it's something that is reflexive structure of heterosexuality. It's impossible to define it if we are not defining it on the basis of deviation of heterosexuality. And there's no other way to define it except for deducing it from heterosexuality. So this is why it doesn't abandon the notion of woman, but it's just reaffirms the notion of woman. There's supposed to be a notion of woman, a notion of, and a basis of and at the basis supposed to be heterosexual sexual act for us to define what lesbianism is. And in this respect, Butler criticized Vedic account, and she reveals that same thing, that there is no clear way to read this description of female homosexuality that is not about a sexual desire for women. So it presupposes the concept of woman. It reaffirms not only the concept of woman, but the centrality of heterosexual sexual act. So woman and man are not concepts on which just heterosexuality is based, that according to Vedic we have to abandon, but the sexuality in general. And woman cannot be eliminated by just replacing it with lesbian, because the concept of lesbianism, it entails the concept of woman and entails the gradation. So it entails the whole gradation of this phallus emanation. And simply because it's part of the scope of sexuality, and the scope of sexuality is structured in this way. And this means that there cannot, probably we should abandon, I like this idea, the concept of woman, but also the concept of lesbian and the whole structure of pansexualistic discourse. And Wittig saw psychoanalysis. She was criticizing psychoanalysis, and she saw it as a prime mover of heterosexual mind, this heterosexual normalization. She criticized it for universalization and over mystification of its concepts, and she claimed that it was in order to heterosexualize personal dimension. And according to her, psychoanalytic discourse is oppressive because it initially centered around the heterosexuality, even in its transformed forms. And when it was starting with Lacan, when it started to be presented as something that deals with symbolic form, it still maintains its oppressive nature. It oppresses in a sense that it prevents from speaking unless you speak in its terms. So she claims that everything which puts them into question is at once disregarded as elementary. Our refusal of the totalizing interpretation of psychoanalysis make the theoreticians say that we neglect the symbolic dimension. These discourses deny us every possibility of creating our own categories. So she criticizes pansexualism for this promotion of heterosexual normativity, and for preventing us of creating new order of materiality, new concept, new vision of the world. And according to Wittig, the one who doubts heterosexuality is denied, in this way, is denied the right to speak. Because if one will speak, it will be claimed that if we don't remain within this structure of heterosexuality, it would be claimed that this analysis is naive, or this is not a proper discourse, not a proper perspective of defined human being. And modern theorists of psychoanalysis that also remain within the trap of sexuality. For example, Alenka Zupancic claims that not giving up on the matter of sexuality constitutes sine qua non of any true psychoanalytic stance. So contemporary psychoanalysis is still sexualistic, and it's the principle of psychoanalysis. And according to Zupancic interpretation and Lacanian interpretation, human sexuality within which the human beings are defined. So she preserves, like Lacan, preserves the understanding of human being as pansexualistic. But what they do, they try to interpret sexuality as a deviation from itself. So according to them, the human sexuality is from the beginning, from its emergence, it doesn't correspond to the norm, and it's kind of initial deviation from the norm that doesn't exist. And this deviation is constitutive characteristic of human sexuality. So it's deviation from itself. And this style of negation, that the claim that sexuality is not really sexuality, sexuality is deviation from itself, it basically the only possible within the sphere of sexuality probably is the only way we are capable to define a human being. Just claiming that if we want to use the concept of sexuality, this is the only thing, and we want to define human beings through this concept, we end up claiming that sexuality is not sexuality. So just this game of negation we have to play to define a human being in this way. And it is because probably it's because this initial meaning of sexuality is hierarchical and rigid, and this is why when we want to preserve it, we face in the problem when we want to construct more diffuse definition of human reality, and at the same time when you want more diffuse definition, less hierarchical definition or non-hierarchical definition of human reality, and we at the same time we want to stay within the framework of sexuality, all we can say is sexuality is not sexuality, or sexuality is initial deviation from itself. So just in this not affirming words, but in the way of negation. And for the time, we will remain with the field of sexuality as something, as a basis of our self-definition. Will be forced to retain only the terms of negation, claiming that sexuality is not sexuality, because sexuality initially is rigid. It's not something that we now want to have in order to define ourselves. So because we want to define ourselves as in a non-hierarchical and diffuse way, and sexuality, the discourse of sexuality is not good for us because it's hierarchical by its nature. So only thing we can claim is the sexuality we define ourselves through is not sexuality. So on the last meeting, we discussed that Freudian thinking, at the basis of his thinking was that human beings are driven by sexual instinct, and sexual instinct understood in rather everyday way. And the point of departure of Freudian thinking is like exclusive attribution of a primal sexual desire to adult masculine character. And because of the figure of a male, because the figure of the male is at the center of Freud understanding of sexuality, he perceived childhood sexuality, so he includes all the other elements of our reality as secondary. They turn out to be secondary in comparison to this basic, the center of sexuality, that is male's phallus. And for example, childhood sexuality is perceived by Freud once it is placed and in the scope of the discourse of sexuality. Once something is placed in there, it starts to be defined as secondary in comparison to the reality of a phallus. For example, of a male adult heterosexual desire. And for example, the childhood or child, if placed within the scope, it is defined as a stage of preparation for adult sexuality. And in his view, in Freud's view, child sexuality is not self-sufficient phenomena. It is a just underdeveloped form of adult normal sexuality, male sexuality, of course, and its goal is eventually to develop into adult sexuality. And Freud is forced to claim that infantile sexuality is perverse version. This is why he claimed it is perverse, because it's not normal yet. And in the course of development of sexuality, child sexuality turns into something from something deviated, from something perverse into something normal. And Freud's view is teleological because he proclaims that adult sexuality is the goal of childhood sexuality. So childhood sexuality is not self-sufficient phenomena. It's just a stage of preparation. The other figure, the figure of woman, same thing. If it's placed within the scope of sexuality, If you want to define woman, try to define woman within the scope of sexuality, and it only exists within the scope of sexuality, of the scope of division of human beings into sexes. And the woman within the scope within which it exists, it is interpreted as Freud as secondary in comparison to a figure of man, woman, and mother. And the whole account of femininity and motherhood is developed in Freud theory as a deviation from masculine pattern of development. And Freud implicitly presupposes masculine pattern of behavior as the basis, as associate this with a normal, undeviated development. So normal is the sexuality of adult men. And the key concept in Freud's thinking was, in Freud's thinking about femininity, is penis envy. He claims that woman's psyche carries the penis envy within it, and her femininity is a result of it. So he defined femininity, woman, through the concept of penis, and so through the penis. And in his attempt to answer the question how women come into being and how woman develops out of a child, he comes to a conclusion that once girls discover the physical differences between boys and girls, that is the genitalia, they develop envy, presupposing that boys enjoy more sexual pleasure. And Freud believed that, let's see, as soon as girls experience the sight of the genitals of other sex, they at once notice the difference, and it must be admitted its significance too. They feel seriously wrong, often declare that they want to have something like it too, and fall victim to envy of the penis. So this is how he defines the development of a girl, that she feels the envy for a penis, and she feels seriously wrong. And this is a woman, someone who is deprived of penis and is not happy about it. So this is Freud's definition of femininity. And as we see, because it is placed within the pansexualistic perspective, it's defined as something secondary to the adult sexual desire. And so from Freud's theory follows that girl's body being deprived of penis is just initially castrated, and it signifies the absence of penis. So in Freud's account, female body is defined in reference to primal male body, and accordingly it is marked as not self-sufficient, as something incomplete. And in Freud, woman reaches the peak of her femininity when she transforms penis envy into the wish to have a baby. And according to Freud, woman wishes to have a baby as a substitute of a penis. The woman is suffering from her insufficient body, and only she's satisfied when she becomes a mother, because the feminine situation is only established if wish for a penis is replaced by one for a baby. So not only woman, Freud defined, not only figure of woman is defined in Freud through the reference to the primal body of male, but also the phenomena, the figure of mother defined is in this way, in the way of referring to male sexual desire as a primal phenomena. And mother-child attachment is defined in Freud as something that is secondary and derivative from sexuality, from male sexuality. The infant's attachment to caregivers is a manifestation of perverse sexual desire, perverse because it's adult male sexual desire, and therefore infant's attachment to a caregiver is a deviated normal desire of male. And the woman's tenderness toward the child, mother tenderness toward the child, is also interpreted as masked, deviated sexual desire for a male partner. And in his attempt to understand the nature of mother-child bond, Freud's thinking forced to come to this paradoxical conclusion that although this type of bond the mother-child attachment, it appears chronologically first. This is what we all hopefully experience when we are children. Attachment to a caregiver and caregivers attachment, care for us. Even if it's chronologically first, Freud comes to this paradoxical conclusion. He managed to invert this chronology and presents it as a something secondary in comparison, as a derivative from the male sexuality, which is not that logical. And things this, because this pansexualistic account presupposes the centrality of the figure of an adult heterosexual man, it turns out that all other figures, once they enter the sphere of sexuality, like woman, mother, children, mother-child attachment, they are considered as deviation from this center. And in my opinion, the most radical turn towards the way out of this pansexualistic perspective that is suggested by traditional psychoanalysis is Elizabeth Fisher book, Woman's Creation. It was published in 1979. But because she herself remains within the pansexualistic perspective, she still lacks one logical step to complete this overcoming of pansexualistic perspective, but she's moving towards this overcoming. So Fisher offers a feminist view of human evolution, and she suggests that the main couple that determines the direction of human evolution, the key couple for human evolution, for human history, was mother-child couple, not the male-female one. And although such switch that the center now is mother and child couple and not the male-female couple, this switch promises the revolutionary switch of perspective, this from switch from the pansexualistic point of view. It's still, the revolution kind of cancels itself on a hallway, because Fisher argumentation still remains within pansexualistic discourse. And same like Freud, she considers that mother-child bond is sexual in its nature. This is her mistake. Even if mother-child is at the center in her interpretation, it still preserves the idea that this bond is initially sexual. But how is it sexual if it's not two sexes? And she claims that she made this feminist claim that the sexuality of mother-child couple has to be emancipated. And by trying to show that pair of mother and child is primal, what she does, she inherits the structure of Freud theory, trying to show that this pair is primal, but it is primal still in a field of sexuality. And this sexuality is something that connects a child and mother, and this sexuality has to be kind of emancipated because it was stigmatized and because of the centrality of male-female couple. But she never dares to go outside of pansexualistic perspective. And it's much easier by overcoming of pansexualistic perspective to claim that mother couple is primal. Because if you remain within the pansexualistic structure, it's illogical to claim that mother-child couple is primal. So she formulates her idea in terms of emancipation of repressed sexuality. That is today, from the standpoint of one who fights against the central element instead of establishing a new center. And Fisher claims that in our culture, where civilization and brain have begun to control physical and purely emotional responses, and where the patriarchy has ruled these thousands of years, there is a rejection and fear of maternal sexuality. Maternity is culturally defined and differentiated from sexuality, so that women are asked to deny the evidence of the senses by repressing the sexual component of infant care. It is to immense advantage to restrict women's sexual gratification to adult heterosexual intercourse, though women and children may pay the price of less demanding relationship. So in her interpretation, the centrality of mother-child couple is like emancipation, presupposes emancipation of sexuality. And basically it is And this is more or less intuitive for our thinking. We tend to struggle to liberate sexuality and women's sexuality, maternal sexuality. We think this is what we have to do, but the very struggle for such liberalization, it means the very struggle preserves us within the patriarchal worldview without overcoming it. We might fight on its terms, but we fight from the place it allocates us, from this place where we are secondary. And it is a trick this patriarchal mind plays on us. And though this trick is further established and spreads pansexualistic perspective. And for Fisher, sex remains everything. And the most intimate dimension of human interaction, human intimacy is, and the essence of human materiality. So within Fisher's account, assigning a primary role to the mother-child couple implies that this couple was the primary bearer of sexuality. Whether the patriarchal view unfairly attributes this sexuality to the couple of male and female. So although Fisher's idea and her aspiration to turn the view on evolution by shifting this patriarchal perspective, they can be considered revolutionary, but it is still a part of this Freudian pansexualistic perspective centered around sexuality and those around the male normal heterosexual sexuality. So for this reason, the trick playing with which Fisher attempted to accomplish, this revolution contradicts her objectives. So her objectives was to overcome the centrality of male and male-female couple, but by placing this, by still remaining within the scope of sexuality, she obviously failed to do it. And she explains the relationship between mother and child by projecting on them the normal sexuality. This is what because claiming that they are primal bearers of sexuality, she just projects a conceptualization of male-female sexuality, and which was sexuality, that is some reality that is originally associated with two sexes, with heterosexual genital intercourse, with phallocentrism, and all this. So even if we claim that a child mother couple is central, if we preserve this couple within the sphere of sexuality, it just doesn't work this way. It works only as it still remains just a projection of the initially central couple. It's just projection of the basic concept, and there is no way out of it if we remain within the scope of sexuality. So the solution that Fisher offered is to liberate woman and mother by subtracting sexual power from the figure of male and assigning it to a figure of woman and a figure of the mother-child couple. But such solution remains within pansexualistic perspective, so it contradicts and kind of cancels itself, because the very term sexuality inevitably implies the male centricity, because it's originally constructed as centered around the figure of adult male. So no matter how much effort we put into the conceptualization or shifting of sexual power from adult male to the other figures, it will be assigned to them only as to a secondary, as kind of stolen and something that does not belong to them. It's still the same principle, just nothing changed. Nothing can be changed within this pansexualistic discourse in a significant way. So by putting woman, mother-child attachment into the context of sexuality, we are forced to consider them as secondary, as defined in relation to the male figure and this coital heterosexual relationship. Because no matter how wide meaning we ascribe to sexuality, the term itself implies this primal role of male figure. But what if you do something else here and suggest that mother-child relationship are not sexual, they are primal? Just consider that we can consider that they are primal at the same time not sexual. meaning they are not yet sexual, and they are not yet sexual, and they are not sublimated kind of sexuality. It's not deviated kind of sexuality. It's just not sexual at all. So at the same time, we can claim that in relation to human sexuality, they are not less crucial. And by claiming this, we switch the perspective, recognizing mother-child relationship as non-sexual, but at the same time as primal in comparison to, at least not less primal, in comparison to sexual relationships. So in post-Freudian theory, they attempt to show that they are not, the mother-child relationship are not less sexual than adult heterosexual relationship like Kristeva. And I suggest another possible solution, that instead of theorizing mother-child relationship as this also sexual, we can presume that they are not sexual, but at the same time not less archaic and not less carnal in comparison to sexual relationship. So from such perspective, it would be possible to manifest that carnal intimacy was just was restricted by patriarchal ideology, and it can be within the pansexualistic view, it can be thought of as something not sexual. So this carnality of human proximity and intimacy, it can be even thought as something not sexual. And breastfeeding women, the act of breastfeeding, it is like the connection between mother and child. There are reasons to claim that it is sexual, and the reason is that it feels quite similar, because breastfeeding women, they claim that a sensation during sexual intercourse is alike to a sexual pleasure, and even to the point of orgasm. For example, some researchers claim that many women find breastfeeding sexually pleasurable, and they answered affirmative in the affirmative when they were asked, "Did you experience while breastfeeding pleasurable contraction in a uterine region?" So, and also lots of women are orgasming while breastfeeding. So the pleasure, the feeling are the same, and this is why we tend to interpret this breastfeeding as a sexual act, but it's not obvious. And to explain this similarity, we can turn to early researchers on the field of sexuality and breastfeeding, that is Niels Newton. He published with his wife his article called "Sexual Responsiveness, Birth and Breastfeeding." I think you have it in your folder. And in this article, they suggest that there are two basic interrelated, connected acts of reproduction. The one of them is coitus. It is aimed on the conception of life, and the other is breastfeeding, aimed at maintenance of life. So two acts of reproduction instead of one, coitus and breastfeeding, and both are crucial for survival. Since evolution is always utilizing the most economic means of it can have, it didn't generate a significant difference between those feelings that we feel when we have coitus and when we breastfeed. So those feelings, this carnal pleasure is basically same. The sensual pleasure is not quite different when it comes to those two acts of reproduction. And Newton claimed that the survival of the human race long before the concept of duty was evolved depended on the satisfaction gained from two voluntary acts of reproduction, coitus and breastfeeding. And so this has to be sufficiently pleasurable to ensure their frequent occurrence. So just one mechanism, or not two separated mechanisms of essential pleasure. It's still one body, one mucus. So it's supposed to feel kind of same, because those both two acts are crucial for our reproduction, and they supposed to feel same because they're to the same extent, were to the same extent important. And another researcher, a follower of Newton theory, that is Dale Bach, clarifies how the close connection of acts of reproduction can be seen through the description that she provides. So how we can see that they are kind of one thing. Those two acts of reproduction are similar. Here is her description. She claimed that tactile stimulation produces an erection on the erogenous bodily protuberance, accompanied by excitation of both participants' genitals. Subsequently, a white life-promoting fluid, one life-creating, the other life-sustaining, is ejected from the protuberance into the orifice of the other participant. The process has two effects: sensual pleasure in both participants and the promotion of human life. Now, to connect the two processes sequentially, it is essential to human reproduction that first a human life is produced, coitus, and second that human life is preserved, breastfeeding. So here we can see this description show there is lots of similarities between those two acts of reproduction, and there is no actually there are no argument that we can provide for choosing just one of them as central. And same as Fisher, Bach implies that from the evolutionary perspective, mother-child bond is not less important than male-female bond, and this act of reproduction is not one of the acts of reproduction is not less important than the other one. And same as Fisher, Bach also slips into this pansexualistic perspective, and she claims that sexuality should not be reserved only for male-female bond. So she still, even if they see all of them, they see that those two acts of reproduction are crucially important for survival, and they have lots of similarities. They still tend to interpret the other act of reproduction as sexual. So as in Freudian, this pansexualistic way, as a reflection of heterosexual sexual act. So revealing this common biological basis for two acts of reproduction, Newton, Bach, and other researchers conclude that both of them are sexual in their nature. So because they're saying both of them sexual. And so she tends to explain one of them, breastfeeding, as an analogy of the other one, the primal ones, the one that still remains the primal, the sexual intercourse, and claiming that the breastfeeding is also sexual. And the question is here that why among, if we see them as equally important for evolution, why do we, that one act is life creating, one is life sustaining, but both are crucially different, crucially important for survival? Why do we just the first one is always has to be interpreted as a central, and the second one should be explained as analogy, just as analogy? And what we can do is we can try to do the reverse, to see the act of breastfeeding just for the experiment, to see it as a central, to see it from this perspective, just to switch our understanding of human intimacy, human carnality, human carnal intimate contact as based on this act of reproduction. And it's turned out to be more logical. And by the way, it also emancipates penis, because if it's seen, it's presented as a total evil within this pansexualistic perspective, with the center as some center of power. But if you do if you overcome this pansexualistic perspective and try to interpret what penis is within this new perspective, as a mother-child with a breastfeeding act at the center, and the coitus and the penis centrality as the something that derivates something as an analogy to it, we will see that this emancipates penis, because it is seen as something that gives pleasure and it's important for, so not the evil, right? And so I'm not trying to suggest here a new feminocentric perspective, or perspective that is centered around the mother-child perspective, because any kind of centrated perspective probably is not good. Just and it would remain a projection of phallocentrism. But instead, I'm just trying to find a basis for getting out of the pansexualistic perspective. So just temporary center that we can use to try to see the whole world, the whole human carnality and intimacy in a different way, just not in the one that we got used to. It's kind of a temporary center that will help us to get out of to get rid of any centers, and leaning from this revealed similarity of the sexual act and act of breastfeeding, and through revealing that they are equal they're equally important for reproduction, because one is life sustaining, one is life creating. We can, in a framework of this theoretical experiment, just transfer the perspective from the act of coitus as a central to the act of breastfeeding as seen to see it just as a center of comprehension of human being. And if you do it, it's very interesting, because if the act of breastfeeding is considered as a basis in comprehension of human reality, this overthrows like the whole pansexualistic perspective, and it cascades it destroys all the layers of this emanation of phallus, and it's totally deconstruct the pansexualistic minds. And if you try to see from this perspective the human reality, everything will be different. Everything will be ruined, and there are going to be no woman and man, because woman and man are those concepts that are structured within the discourse of sexuality within a strict hierarchical division, and because they're defined as different, as something in relation to the centrality of penis and phallus. So there are no men and women, and there is no men, there is no women, because there is no, if there is no woman, there is no mother, because she was understood, the mother was understood as the ultimate expression of femininity, and femininity is deviated kind of sexuality. Woman is the one who is deprived of penis. So if there is no woman, there is no man, there is no mother, and the child, because the child was understood as the bearer of underdeveloped sexuality, though there is no child anymore. And there is even no act of breastfeeding itself, because it was initially constructed as a projector of heterosexual acts. So there is nothing. It's just the whole new world from the scratch that we can, human world. And there is no even human, because since Freud defines human beings as driven by sexual instinct, there are no humans. So there is nothing, just the scratch that we can use to create a whole new materiality. Something Monique Wittig was talking about, that we need to create a new conceptualization of materiality. And if you kind of start from this point, when we first saw act of breastfeeding as a central, and then we just from this starting point just deconstructed the whole world, just turned into a scratch. We opened kind of a space where we can create the new conceptualization. So yeah, it looks like the end of the class, but I hope that from now on we can might use some of these ideas to create a new world. So do you have any ideas or comments or questions? If you need, you can unmute. If you need to ask, you can unmute yourself and ask, or you can type the question in the chat box. If there are no questions, you can still, if you come up with ideas of new world or criticism of the idea of creating new world from the scratch, you can send me emails. My class is child trauma love, it's called, and we'll discuss child trauma and love. And I think it will start in March. So for those of you who wants to take us, I will see you during the next class. And if you'll come up with some questions or ideas, you can send me email informing me. We then see you in 1 month. Bye. Okay, one comment. Okay, you can still hear you if you can't use the camera. We don't. So you can type a question in a chat box. Yeah. The whole discussion reminds me about the question Gordon Manta Clark posted for architecture. That's interesting. I have no idea what was the question, but I will copy it and save it to find out. Unless you want to tell me about it. Oh, with architecture, he disables the function of architecture as a creature of, like, wow, yeah, livable space. This is interesting. Yeah, I think is this the strategy of thought can be like implemented in all the ways, in all the spheres. It's really interesting to do. If you understand that concepts are changeable, you can play with this fact and try to see or to create a new vision of, to deconstruct the old vision and to create on the basis of it the new vision. And sexuality appears to pose the same question. We can think of it as the building that contains our desire. Oh, yeah, that's interesting. I didn't think about it as in terms of architecture. Thank you. And even Butler, she's pessimistic about it because we were talking about Monique Wittig, the way she criticizes her that those concepts of lesbians are not good enough, and they still presuppose the concept of woman. And Butler's pessimistic mood here is that she claims that symbolical order is already is something that functions. We can't change it. We can't just invent concept and see world through those new concepts, because the symbolical order is not something we can master. But and this is her pessimism, that we can't transform the reality by just changing concept. And I don't agree with her in this way, because I think we should be more optimistic and try all the different new concepts and see how reality will change if we use them. Yeah, why should sexuality be predicated on the male-female division? Why not predicated on the body own and other body? Yeah, it might, but because the very word sexuality presupposes sex. Unfortunately, it's inbuilt in the very, and it would be great, of course, to see this as based on bodies and proximity of bodies and be defined in this way, but still it's not that easy to transform the word, the concept that is already based on the hierarchical structure of male and female, into the totally different dimension and understanding. But of course that was what feminist discourse was trying to do, to transform, to create a new type of sexuality, to emancipate sexuality. I see it as a connection of body. I call it eroticism or something, but still it's more radical to create some other understanding of human proximity as proximity of human bodies that are not defined, which essence of which is not seen in sexes, in sexual division on sexes. But yeah, it's more radical just to create a new discourse instead of sexual, and which will like presuppose to the proximities, intimacy of bodies, not intimacy of male, female, and the way we negate those through even using the concept of gender, which is still based on the concept of male and female, like deviated version or transformed version, but still the roots of those are male and female and pansexuality. So the other, it's interesting to find out what might be the types of self-definition of the future, which are not totally not based on sexuality, not even deviated or diffused types of sexuality like those genders. Is there any other way for us to define ourselves, and what will happen if we will define the truth of ourselves in a totally different discourses? Not totally, but different. Are there any other questions or comments? Okay. Is it valid to think the possibility for the failure of love now as nourishment and care in its very own terms, and not just because of the repressive nature of Freudian pansexualistic perspective? Is it equally radical, even though it might be too pessimistic? Um, yeah, probably. What do you think? Is it valid to think? And we need to define love here, I think. Because in Freud, love is defined as a sublimation of sexual instinct. And for me, love is uh, manifestation of care and nourishment, and sexuality is just part of uh, part of this care and nourishment, kind of one of the ways. Yeah, and we can't. I think it's impossible to talk about failure of love, because this is what basically the very possibility for us to exist is love, like taking care of the other and not killing each other. Otherwise, if there is no love, there is no humanity. I mean, love, and even in those transformed forms of love where we just mm, not just take care of each other or nourish each other, just don't respect other and don't kill them, at least don't destroy them. That is love. Since we are alive, it's love is alive as well. It's no love, no humanity, we're all dead. Which is also although pessimistic, though radical way. Are there any other questions? Does sexuality have or be defined in terms of division? Has to be defined. I think it has to be defined because I don't like the term sexuality and I don't like division. So I think it's like the ultimate truth of sexuality that it presupposes this division into male and female. Like, although two opposites or hierarchical division was men as the center and woman as something deviated from the center. And I think here, because the very word sexuality presupposes sex, and sex presupposes division on half. I think it is about division. And if you want to think about human intimacy and this in a diffused way, in terms of bodies, which are not like are not divided into opposites, I think we shouldn't use the term sexuality in if you want to conceptualize human reality in this way. Okay, then no more questions. If there is no more questions, I will see you on the next class about child trauma and love. Some of you who wants to take it, and we will talk about child trauma and love, and we'll connect all of those concepts, and we'll see the traumaticity of love, of child, and of life. And we'll talk about destructive malabusstrom, of destructive plasticity, and we'll also see the whole formation through childhood to intimate relationship as based on traumas. So it's going to be pessimistic revolutionary perspective. Okay, then I see you all not some of you, next month, I think in March. Bye bye.